feels incredibly interesting to be on this side, I have to say. I'm glad you're all here. My name is Jen Miller, and I'm with the League of Women Voters, but I'm also with the Ohio Women's Suffrage Monument Commission that's working on getting a monument on the Statehouse lawn. And that's what today is really about, and it's an exciting day. Before we get started, I wanted to just mention that Dr. Ange Marie Hancock, it doesn't move. Oh, but yeah, you can put that down. Oh, look at that. Dr. Ange Marie Hancock has laryngitis, so I was supposed to be the MC for both, but I'm happy to do this program. I'm a really big fan of both of these, so I'm excited about it. But let me first explain why we're here, and Senator Kunze is here, and as is Elizabeth Smith, a couple of the commissioners with me. In 2019, the General Assembly approved the formation of the Women's Suffrage Commission, and Senator Kunze was one of the sponsors of that. And it was tasked with commemorating the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which declared that no one could be denied the right to vote because of their sex. One of the most important projects currently in progress is that we are working on erecting a monument on the grounds of the Ohio Statehouse to honor and uplift women and to recognize history makers. This monument and programs like this one today are designed to acknowledge the incredible women in Ohio's history who have fought to achieve advances in voting rights. The monument also honors women today and in the future who have, do, or will use their voices to continue meaningful, positive changes. We believe that the placement of the monument is key, and there are no other monuments on the grounds of the Statehouse depicting real women. We know that the monument will help state leaders and visitors, as well as school children, better understand the contributions of women who fought for equality at the ballot box and continue to fight for equality for all people. Nationally, less than 5% of all public monuments, public statues of people, depict real women. Today's panels and special presentations by the Commission lead up to an evening with world-renowned presidential historian and public speaker and Pulitzer Prize winner, New York Times #1 bestseller, Doris Kearns Goodwin. And we want to thank the Capitol Square Foundation for making this event possible. All the proceeds for this evening's event go for the monument, which will be installed on the Ohio Statehouse grounds in 2026. And we will be... And we will present the artists and show a selection of the concept by the artists later this evening. We will be able to share that with others in the near future. If you're interested in supporting the monument, please go to the Cap Square Foundation website. It's long. But if you go there, you will find a donation link, and we need all sizes. You know, I want to see that we have donations from all 88 counties. And yes, we know it's going to take some big donations, but we also want to know that folks that they had $5, that they threw their $5 in, because this is our Ohio, this is our Statehouse, and we will all be better by commemorating women and seeing women leaders. And so with that, I'm going to introduce our two panelists, and I really am fans of both of them. I'm not a fan of reading bios. So what I want is each of them to give us 30 seconds or a minute of who they are. So first, Dr. Treva Lindsey from Ohio State University, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much, Jen. It's a pleasure to be back in physical space with you after doing a lot of work regarding the commemoration of the 19th Amendment, and then COVID, of course, kind of clamped down on a lot of in-person engagement. So as she said, my name is Treva B. Lindsey. I am a professor at Ohio State University. I've been there now for 11 years, which is very strange to say. I also went to undergrad at Oberlin College, so Ohio has become home for me in a shocking way. I'm a DC girl, so from the nation's capital, but Ohio has been home now for about 15 years altogether. I look at African-American women's history, social movement history, and the intersection between popular culture and historical social movements. I've written 2 books. My first book, Colored No More, had a chapter specifically about Black women's activism around suffrage. And then my second book, called America Goddamn, a little provocative title and a riff on Nina Simone's song, Mississippi Goddamn, is a history of violence against Black women in the United States. And I'm currently working on a book called Words Mean Things.
Oh, wow.
And thinking about the kind of history of certain words, certain phrases that come into our kind of social lexicon and become politicized and engaged, but kind of tracing the history of those and their contemporary meanings. So I'm really excited to be here today and to talk about suffrage and women's rights and voting and to get this statue erected here. It's very important.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Katherine Jellison, probably many of you know her, but would you please tell us about yourself?
Okay. Well, thanks for inviting me here this afternoon. I'm a professor of U.S. women's and gender history at Ohio University, and I've been there for 31 years. I've lived in the state of Ohio longer than I've lived anywhere else, and so certainly have come to think of Ohio as home as well, even though I'm not a native. This semester, I'm teaching a course on the history of the state of Ohio, and I'm also teaching a course entitled Women in American History Before 1877. So I've been doing a lot of thinking about Ohio, about the history of Ohio, of course, always the history of U.S. women, and the time period I'm teaching about this semester, pre-1877, we've been talking a lot about the birth of the 19th century women's movement and the first well-publicized call for women's right to vote at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And let's see, what else? I have written 2 books, co-authored 1 book that came out just last year, lots of book chapters and journal articles, but they all have at their center the experiences of women in U.S. history. And and I'm quoted a lot in the press about topics about gender, women, and U.S. politics. And so, as you can imagine, this last week, I've received a lot of emails and phone calls, and someone from some British newspaper is supposed to be emailing me some questions while I'm sitting here today. I said, I'm traveling today. I can't talk to you on the phone. Just email me the questions. I'll answer them when I get home. So, anyway, that's a little bit about me.
Great, thank you. All right, so I'm going to ask you what the 19th Amendment did, and I'm going to ask you what the 19th Amendment didn't do.
Okay. Well, Treva might have more to say than I do. Obviously, the 19th Amendment allowed women who were over the age of 21 and didn't have other restrictions on them the right to vote. Just a couple of days ago, I did a talk for some senior citizens in Rochester, Minnesota. It was obviously a virtual talk, and I showed a headline from the Lowell, Massachusetts newspaper after that 36th state, Tennessee, had ratified the 19th Amendment, and the headline was, "All women in the U.S. to vote in the 1920 election." And then I show pictures of some of the women I'm sure Treva's going to talk about who didn't automatically have the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. So the women it most benefited were white women, white native-born women who didn't have other kinds of roadblocks set up to prevent them to vote. Either they didn't have access to citizenship, and again, I'm sure we will hear Dr. Lindsey talk about those issues, or this being the Jim Crow era in the U.S. South, where the majority of black citizens still lived at that time, there were state and local laws in place that prevented black women from using their 19th Amendment rights, just as those state and local laws were preventing black men from using their 15th Amendment rights. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Lindsey.
Thank you. I think that's a really great summary and a sea of who is, and so there's a lot of who ain't, right, in this conversation around the 19th Amendment, and which is why we often think about it as a commemoration, not necessarily a celebration for all women, right? The kind of flattening of women to a category of white, native-born, as you mentioned, women. And still, even with that, there are still some qualifying things in here. Depending on where you are, we're talking about poll taxes, literacy tests, other barriers. What could you actually access in the context of your family and your community, access to the ballot, who was provided with polling places? These kinds of things are all of these informal barriers as well as legal barriers that still exist. And so you have acts that come after that and legislation that come after that that slowly move us towards more universal suffrage. So you have amendments that are targeting Indigenous women being able to vote, Indigenous people broadly, Chinese Americans specifically being able to vote. So this is pushing back against late 19th century, early 20th century laws and policies that were deeply anti-immigrant and specifically anti-Chinese in the government. So you have that coming into play. You have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So if we think about both the passage, ratification, and moving into August 26th of 1920, right, it takes almost 45 years until after that we get the Voting Rights Act, which allows for greater enfranchisement of African Americans, Latinx people, a more inclusive franchise, and also the abolishing eventually of poll taxes and literacy tests. So people who are still even getting to the ballot and registering to vote, there's still barriers once you get to the ballot and try and vote. Can you guess the number of jelly beans in this jar? The tests go from all the way from kind of actual tests about kind of civil knowledge, civics knowledge that we think about, to these very obscure, ridiculous kinds of tests. But there's incredible evidence around this and the reality of violence that is attendant to even registering people to vote at this point. So these are not technically legal barriers, but they are extra legal barriers that have systemic consequences for these communities.
And I think I'm just going to mention some of the other ones we don't think about, right? 18 years old, right? Accessibility for people with disabilities, that happened in the 1980s. Yeah. Military and overseas voters, also 1986. So just the project, one of the things I love about the work we're doing is we're trying to think about the value of the vote. Yes. And how it wasn't extended equally to all people, but why we need to continue to think about access to the ballot for all people. Can we talk for a minute? And the reason why I ask this question is I think a lot of us engage young people, and they think that their vote doesn't matter. And I think that there are a couple moments in time where the ballot gets extended to a large group of people and we see dramatic changes in government and rights. Certainly one, is the Voting Rights Act. But before that is the 19th Amendment. So can we talk about what life looked like before and after the 19th Amendment? What changed as women got that right to vote? And give you the same question.
Okay. Well, first of all, before the 19th Amendment, there was, of course, a patchwork, state by state, with different voting laws, whether or not women were allowed to vote. This made it a federal policy that adult women at that point, age 21 and older, who were citizens, supposedly had the right to vote. But we've talked about various barriers, legal and extra-legal, that made it more difficult, especially for women of color. But one thing that we see with the 19th Amendment is, for the first time, shortly after the amendment became part of the Constitution in 1920, we saw the passage of a law that was called the Shepherd-Towner Act of 1921, that was a law that was passed with a lot of support and time and energy on the part of the newly enfranchised women voters who pushed members of the U.S. Congress to support this law that was to improve infant and maternal care in the United States. It set up 3,000 clinics around the country, especially to serve people in inner cities, rural areas that were underserved by healthcare, and a whole network of visiting nurses to follow up on babies and mothers. And this had been proposed by the first woman in the U.S. Congress, Jeanette Rankin of Montana. Unfortunately, she is soon out of Congress, and it's two male members of the Senate and the House whose names we attach to this law. But it's funded for 5 years, and it's seen as a real victory. Wow, here's a women's issue that the newly enfranchised women voters have rallied around. They've pushed their members of Congress. They've helped publicize. The League of Women Voters was very pro-Shepherd-Towner Act, and it improved dramatically the health of new mothers and infants in the United States. So that, I think, made new women voters think we really have some political power here that we will use on down the line. By the time the law is up for refinancing in the mid-1920s, we're in that period of backlash, the Red Scare of the 1920s, the growing influence of the new Ku Klux Klan, reaction against more of the women who'd been left-leaning suffragists are being red-baited. So there is a conservative reaction against the Shepherd-Towner Act, and as a compromise, it is not refunded for another full 5 years, but merely 2.5 years. So here we have this wonderful law, which is considered the first social safety net law in the U.S., long before the New Deal reforms. But it doesn't even live out to the end of the 1920s. It goes off the books for lack of funding in 1929. So there's that optimism about how women voters can change the picture of American life and the way we lead our daily lives. But boy, we have to keep on it. We can't let our guard down. And I think that was an important lesson learned from that experience with the Shepherd-Towner Act. And then periodically, of course, there have been other issues that women voters have coalesced around. But I think it's always important to remember that, women voters are not a monolith.
Yeah.
We're divided by race, by class, and philosophies of government.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then I just wanted to throw out there that I do know that the League championed this, and I do know that it was not equally celebrated, and it did not benefit all women.
Right.
And so I would love for you to dig into that, because I think that's a lesson we at League, as well as all of us as advocates, can learn from. So I want you to do that, and then I want you to also think about how government changed.
Yeah, so what you're going to hear a lot today is that it's always complex, right? There are not these kind of clean sweep victories on this path to enfranchisement or what it looks like for women to be in government, women as voters, that monolith thing. I know it almost feels cliche to say, like, we're not a monolith. It's like, of course, look at our room right today, right? We're not a monolith. We come into this space with different perspectives, different experiences, different material realities, right? And what powers you to vote, right? What are the things that make you vote, right? What are the questions and considerations that you're asking? So when I think about that act, and I think about contemporarily, the U.S. largely's terrible maternal morbidity rates, but specifically is experienced by Black women in the United States, and the kind of legacy of the attempt to address infant mortality and maternal morbidity, maternal health that is ushered in by this, that does not necessarily get to poor Black communities, even poor rural communities. There's a lot of ties and connections that we can see between those, despite sometimes being seen as juxtaposing interest, right? Political interest. But when it comes to maternal health outcomes, we see a lot of similarities between those communities. And with that backlash that happens, I often think about this period of the mid to late 1920s going into much like I think of like Reconstruction and the backlash that happens after Reconstruction. So we have this kind of radical reimagining of the United States that's happening in the aftermath of the Civil War, right? We get the Reconstruction era amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? And it feels like we're on the precipice of something new, and then Jim Crow realism sets in. And a new wave of racial violence emerges, and new policies, new legislation throughout the United States, not just the U.S. South, that really anchor us into a racial hierarchy. And I think in the aftermath of the 19th Amendment, we see a similar kind of retrenchment and pushback against what women might be able to do. Because what we do see when we start to see the real impact over time of women as voters, that some of the needs that come to the forefront are about a social safety net. They're about education, right? Different approaches to that, very different approaches to that, and what communities are centered in that. But what you do see as a thread, as a consideration for health, education, kind of community, neighborhood, family, that are rising to the top of the priorities of women voters. And you start to see some coalescing that happens after time around this. If we think about the National Women's Party, who's one of the major forces behind the kind of newer phase of suffrage activism of the early 20th century, after the 19th Amendment is ratified, the next thing they really harp in on from a legislative point is the Equal Rights Amendment.
Yeah. 1923, you might not realize.
Right. It's really early because we tend to think about
introduced.
that much later, decades later, but it's in 1923 that we first get that kind of advocacy and coalescing around this notion of equal rights. So I think that there's a considerable interest as women voters grow, and they're expecting in 1920 to see this groundswell that doesn't really materialize in the same way. Although you have African-American women who register at unprecedented numbers in 1920, you do see barriers there and who actually is able to vote. It's going to be a couple decades before you really see that kind of seismic shift in terms of a woman's block and the way we talk about a women's block in voting.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. So I've heard some call it the maternalization of the state. So can you define what that is, and do you agree that that's what happened?
Well, first of all, since Dr. Lindsey brought up the National Women's Party, I'm wearing my jailhouse door pin. These were the women who engaged in civil disobedience and got arrested and went on hunger strikes, and then they would commemorate their time in jail with their jail door pin, or sometimes they wore it as a necklace. Mm-hmm. So I did want to point out that I'm appropriately garbed or accessorized for this topic today. Yeah, well, I think this is a really interesting topic, this maternalization of U.S. government, that the first issue that there was that hope that women would be a more unified voting bloc that they really championed was this maternal infant care law, the Shepard-Tanner Act. But something that had convinced, you have to recognize, it's quite obvious that women had to get the support of men in the U.S. Congress to pass the 19th Amendment, and then you had to get men in the state legislatures to, you had to get that 3/4 of the states to ratify, which at that time would have been 36 states, Tennessee the 36th. There were men and women who were very convinced by the argument that if you do give women the vote, they will do all these wonderful things with it, these wonderful nurturing things with it, social housekeeping, that they will vote for lawmakers who care about things like parks and care about things like schools. And in fact, you two probably already know this, but Gloria Steinem's grandmother was, I believe, the first woman to be a member of a school board here in Ohio, in Toledo. So actually, women here in Ohio got the right to vote for school board and serve on school boards before the 19th Amendment. Anyway, those kinds of issues that were considered women's issues because women care about children and they care about public safety. And of course, we know that the prohibition movement was also something that was seen as, oh, women, will use that vote to vote in that kind of sort of moral policing, I guess we might call legislation, or in that case, it did turn out to be an amendment for a while there. And, they will make society better, particularly for women and children. And so some people were, men and women, convinced to support women's suffrage with those kind of arguments. Now, that does not mean the National Woman's Party, which said, no, women need the right to vote because we are citizens and deserve those citizens' rights. But an argument that really was probably more persuasive to a larger number of people was that kind of maternalist argument.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's the strategy, and then I think there is the outcome, right? That can look similar and in different. It's undeniable that there is this emphasis on maternal care. There is an emphasis on parks, and some of the first elected women that you're seeing across the country are going to be on boards of education. That's not all that shocking, given that then the strategy would be like, they will care more about our children, right? It relies upon an understanding of what spheres women should be operating in, and what are the things that impact that. So if the sphere is the home and family, then that is the province of education, libraries, parks, certain aspects of healthcare. But there is this sense that if we are talking to people to engage them on supporting suffrage and supporting the expansion of the franchise, how do you talk to people about that? That may be like, well, what's going to happen if women vote, right? They're not going to know what to do. There are people who question women's intelligence, the people who believe they're just going to vote and like their husbands, fathers, or the men in their lives do, right? That's one presumption. So part of this is different groups who are organizing around this use different strategies to engage other people, right? Other women. Not all women were suffragists.
Absolutely.
Not all women supported universal suffrage. I always tell this to my students about when I'm teaching about civil rights, because now there's this very selective amnesia that people have. And they'll be like, we were all on board with Dr. King. That's usually the example that's used. And I was at this protest and I marched with Dr. King. And I'm like, how? All these people claiming this, and estimates from historians suggest that less than 12% of people ever participated in one act of civil disobedience, right? One, not continuously, not sustained, which means it's a very small population. And we can look at polls of various activists about how different folks in the nation felt about them at the time, and you'll see a very stark contrast to the way we commemorate and memorialize now. And so what I think is important to know about that is that convincing folks to get on board with suffrage and this idea of a women's political agenda, which we know there's no such thing, singularly, means that you're going to have a lot of pushback and a lot of people who need to be persuaded. And so I think the maternalization argument was effective. I don't want to deny that it was effective, but I know that it was also very contentious within different women's movements. We're like, no, it's because we're citizens. It's because we need a voice. It's because we need this kind of political capital. It's because we are in a representative democracy that does not represent everyone who's here. And conversely, you have people like, but we need good parks. And we need the home to be stable, and we need help, like we need our childbirthing experiences to be good so our kids are good and our men are cared for. That is the strategy, and it has an efficacy at a moment where there is a deep-seated sexism that is pervading, right? The legislative branch of the government, the executive branch of the government, the judiciary of the government. That's real, right? Because we're saying the congresswoman who was in there is ousted pretty quickly, right? Congressman Rankin. So, there isn't a groundswell of women who are suddenly elected all across the country as a result of this. So we have to think about it in that context.
Thank you for that. I love the way both of you talk about history, because I think there's so much we can learn from together on that. So let's talk about, we had this stat about how few monuments represent real women. And if you walk our Ohio Statehouse grounds, and there are beautiful monuments, but those that have humans, there's one mythical angel creature, but the humans, they're all white men. And I think they are all, have a place in history to be recognized. But what do you think happens psychologically or otherwise when we don't have in our public art representations of change makers that more reflect the demographics of Ohio?
Well, I think it's very important that we do erect this particular statue. I was on the committee that was recommending designs for this monument a couple of years ago, and it was fascinating to see all the designs. And right away, I think 100% of the members of that advisory committee said, we have to have some real women represented here on the Statehouse lawn. And it can't just be white women, that it needs to show the diversity of women who were part of this push for women's right to vote. And it reminded me a lot of something that happened in Central Park in 2020, which was the original design. Central Park is as guilty, right? Probably the most famous city park in the U.S. is as guilty as other parks around the country in not having more representation of real women. There's a statue of Alice in Wonderland in Central Park, but there were very few statues of real women. And the first design for the suffrage monument in Central Park to go up there in 2020 only had white women, and there was a big outcry. You need to diversify the women who are portrayed there. And so the statue now has Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Sojourner Truth. And it is that kind of representation of who we are as a nation in all of our diversity that I would like to see in all of our public artwork. And I know there's only, because I was on that commission, and we tromped along, every blade of grass out here, I realized there's only so much space left for monument building on this grounds. So this suffrage this monument commemorating women's suffrage will be on a precious piece of real estate. And after that, we need to go around the rest of the city of Columbus and the rest of the state and maybe look for less valuable real estate, but centrally located real estate along our highways and byways, and get more representation of people other than white men in the history of this state and the history of our country. So I think, especially when I think of school kids doing tours of the Capitol and the Capitol grounds, kids get inspired by seeing people who look like them and will get inspired to be part of this democratic republic. Maybe as office holders someday themselves, maybe as political activists, but hopefully, right, as voters. Yeah. Right. So I think it's very important.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I've had the pleasure. No matter where I've lived, I've always lived in like the capital city, wherever. Right, so I lived in Washington D.C. That's where I grew up. Well, you take for granted because there's monuments everywhere. And, not even realizing that I had already moved from D.C. before the National Museum of African American History was placed there. I got to do the correspondence for the opening of the museum for BET, which was this amazing thing that I didn't even realize what impact that had on me of thinking about what deserves to be in a museum, who deserves to be commemorated. And of course, after that, the MLK Memorial was erected, and now we have the Indigenous, the Native American Museum, the Latino Museum is coming soon. all on the mall, right? If you've been to DC, it's this huge area in a very small city, when I think about it, that's all about commemoration. And up until the 21st century, there was no federal commemoration of a city, one that was designed from an architectural standpoint by an African American, that was inhabited on lands of indigenous folks who were there prior to the establishment of it as the nation's capital, and at the time was one of the many majority African American cities in the United States, and none of the monuments reflected that or that incredible history. And so when I think about Ohio and how important so many folks are to our story, the range of folks and the ways that these folks pushed each other to have a more robust vision of who we could be, I think it's important that our monuments call us into that. The New York one was such an interesting debate as a historian, because I kept thinking in my mind, I was like, Seneca Falls. Seneca, they're coming because they're inspired by women who are part of Seneca Nation within the Iroquois Federation. Native American women. So like, how was there no representation of Native American women in the talk of U.S. suffrage? The notion of egalitarian practices of political enfranchisement, so much of that is indebted to practices that predate even the formation of the United States as a country, right? This is pre-colonial that we're knowing this, that you're kind of saying, we should do that. And it's like, so where are they in our stories too? And thinking about that. So there's this incredible opportunity in Ohio to tell part of our story that I don't think as many folks know. I think it's inspiring. We say representation matters. I teach popular culture because we know it matters. We know being able to recognize yourself and recognize possibility is so important for our young people, but it's important for us too, in seeing what possibility is, knowing that people in the past, a diverse range of people of age, race, gender, ability, all of that contributed to where we sit today and built where we sit today. And commemorations do that. I used to be someone who was like, why do we need monuments? We just need to teach better history. Most people are not going to be sitting in my classroom. That's just a reality. So what can we do to have opportunities to engage and spark conversations? You're walking around the Statehouse and you see this amazing monument of all these women. Well, who's that? Right? It does something on an affective level, but effectively, it gets us new people running for office. It gets us new conversations about what issues need to be preserved and presented. That's what it does. So it has a material effect when you can see that representation.
Do you mind if I add something? When you talked about Iroquois society, I saw this great cartoon, editorial cartoon, that I show in the women's history class I'm teaching this semester, which is Iroquois women up on a cliff. They're looking down on women who were active in the suffrage movement in New York State. Wow. And as the women are walking by, the suffragists, the white suffragists walking by with their signs, votes for women, and their faces would be recognizable, right, to people who were involved in that movement. One was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, Harriet, was one of the women that's pictured. But the Iroquois women are looking down from the cliff and they're listing all the rights that they had that just now the white suffragists are asking for, including, being responsible for the economy, for the agricultural subsistence of their people. And it's a great image that shows that the role that in this case Iroquois society, but the women had the highest status of probably women anywhere in their role as agriculturalists in the Iroquois Confederacy. And so boy, we should make a statue based on that cartoon. That would
And I want to drive this home
have
because
some great messages.
I want to drive this home that when the 19th Amendment passed, Native Americans were not citizens.
Right.
The
Absolutely.
They had already fought in every war
Right.
on this land. So they had been supporting the government. Citizenship status didn't come till 1924,
Right.
but voting rights was not universally guaranteed until every state did it, and it wasn't until the 1960s.
Yeah.
So I think that that's really important. So let's go there for a second. Why is it important for us to not forget the march towards universal suffrage? Why is it important for us to remember how hard it was to get the rights, not just of women in 1920, but the Voting Rights Act and ADA and all those things? Why is that important for us to know that?
Well, I would say the Voting Rights Act of 1965, of course, is a monumental change that brings about change in all aspects of American society. When you allow black folks who have not been able to vote and get inspired to run for public office, that's changed the face of American politics. But I would also point out that 10 years later, a black congresswoman, Barbara Jordan from Texas, called for amendments that would, in places where more than 5% of the population speaks a first language other than English, ballots have to be provided in that language. So I think those 1975, that amendment to the Voting Rights Act is really important for some of the indigenous people you're talking about too. In the state of South Dakota, to have a ballot in the Lakota language, obviously in the Southwest in the Spanish language, various Asian languages, that's amazing. And so when we think about, 15th Amendment, 1870, 19th Amendment, 1920, Voting Rights Act of 1965, and then I think about 1975 and the amendment that allows for people who are non-English speakers to have better access to the vote. You don't, Treva, but I remember the 1970s. I was around then. And then, the ADA, in 1990, allowing people who are differently abled greater access to polling places and to the vote. So it just keeps expanding because people remain committed, and I hope we will remain committed, regardless of Supreme Court decisions, et cetera, committed to taking voting rights as far as they can go, because I think of all the people who sacrificed. I think of the women. I think of the civil rights activists in the 50s and 60s. I think of people who devoted their lives to acquisition of this right, and including those 3 women on the monument in Central Park. None of them lived to see.
Right.
They all passed away before the 19th Amendment became a reality. If people have sacrificed so much for that right, it's not something the rest of us should take for granted, and I think we need to continue to push for voting rights of all adult Americans, and I think anytime that we feel that there is some backsliding on that issue, we push back. And I also think the wonderful work that the League of Women Voters and other voter education organizations do will inspire people who have that right, I hope they will, to go out and use it, darn it, because literally, in terms of the Voting Rights Act, people literally died for that right.
Yeah. And, I would just add to that when you say it died, I'm thinking of this, and I want to be clear here. They were killed for it.
Oh, yes,
right?
absolutely.
The act of,
yes.
There were people so opposed to voting rights.
Yeah. So it must be a pretty important right.
Right? I mean, I think here, people, now we have the film by Ava DuVernay of Selma and seeing, right, obviously the extraordinary violence on Pettus Bridge with the march that's organized there, but 3 people were killed there, right? There's so many activists who were killed registering people to vote, attempting to vote, who were attacked, who lost their livelihoods, who fought literally to the death, and people who fought, conversely, to kill people to prevent them from being able to vote. You know, whenever I hear and talk about these movements as nonviolent, which the movements themselves were, right? We have hunger strikes. We have, I mean, people don't often think about these kinds of acts of disobedience. You have the jail here, right? The number of people who were incarcerated as a result of their activism for this. That the response to voting rights activism in many spaces was violent. And so I think as a person who has the right to vote today, I not only honor a legacy of struggle and knowing that the right to vote, among many other rights, is so important for being a participant in democracy, however that democracy shows up, right? That doesn't mean you always get what you want because you vote, right? But it does mean that you said, this is where I stand, and this is what I'm going to continue to push for on the day that I vote, before I vote, and after I vote, right? That is what that legacy instills. Very few of the folks that we're talking about who were voting rights activists were singularly voting rights activists. Mm-hmm. They were concerned about a multitude of issues, and voting was one of the significant and meaningful ways that they saw an opportunity and a path to realizing whatever vision they had. And so I think it's important to understand the vote in that context. Historically, when I'm talking and trying to encourage people who are like, I don't think my vote matters, you know, sensing a kind of voter apathy, I remind them not just of that history, and it's a bloody one. It is an absolutely bloody one. I think of my grandparents, my parents, my mother voting is right when the Voting Rights Act passes, right? That she's able to, and going with her mother to vote, who was born 2 years after the 19th Amendment, right? And so I think that there's considerable, like, we go to vote. Or I think about the sorority that I'm a part of, Delta Sigma Theta. Our first public act as a sorority is marching in the March 1913 National March for Suffrage. These women are spat on, they're yelled at, they're derided, and they're in their...
Forced to stand in the back.
Forced to stand in the back. We see Ida B. Wells run up to the front with the Illinois contingent.
That's right. That's my favorite scene.
I love that scene. I want that dramatized on screen. Ida B. Wells. But they're marching in what we call our Sunday best, and presenting that legacy. So that's the legacy that I think about in doing that. And all of the work that you do around that, the community you build when you're doing voter education. It's not just to convince someone to vote, it's saying, what is the vision that you have of the world? What do you want to see that doesn't exist? What do you want to see more of? What do you want to see less of? Who do we get in office that might help us do that? And once they get in there to do that, they can't singularly do it by themselves. So what am I going to do if they do get in office to support that vision coming into existence, right? If we think of the vote as an ongoing project, not a singular solitary act, because that's not what these people marched, died, and or were killed for.
Yeah. But may I add
Yep, and we are
to that
at
really
time.
quickly? Okay.
So
I just wanted to say, thinking of your mom and your grandmother, that we know that the most consistent voters, the people who turn out in the greatest numbers to vote every time, are Black women. And so I think that tells us people who've worked the hardest for the vote see how precious it is, and I feel are excellent role models for the rest of us. So, you know, props to your grandmother.
I'd
and
be
your
in trouble
mom.
if I didn't vote in every election. I'd be in serious. I would not go home to see, my mother's also named Treva, to see Treva Lindsey if I did not. But it's such a, like, she gets dressed to vote. right? She usually goes with like their different days. Her sorority will go, her chapter, and all of this. Meanwhile, I'm like, I'm going to early voting. I'm just gonna get my like hoodie. I just want to get it, I want to get it done. I've researched, I've studied. And I'm always excited. I always wear something that connects me to that legacy. So even if the hoodie is like from my sorority, or it might be like an Ida B. Wells hoodie, or my Harriet Tubman hoodie, because she was a suffragist. And that's not often part of the legacy that we talk about her in. And she's a disabled Black woman who sees and is advocating for the rights of the aging before we really get to think about folks who are advocating for folks like that, like establishing a place of rest. And so she understands the ballot as a place where she can exercise some power to do that. So I think it's so, so important that we commemorate that legacy and continue to encourage people to vote. You know, I get to tell a bunch of 18 to 24-year-olds on a regular basis how important their vote is across, because my students are international. So it's not just students in the U.S., but voting. We're there, and the U.S. kind of lags behind in voting turnout, so we got to do better.
Yeah, we do.
We got to do a lot
Ohio lags
better.
behind too sometimes.
Yeah, we got to get more voters, more people voting, more people invested and educated about voting. Some people just don't know what voting is, which may seem off to people, but literally what it means to get a ballot, look at an issue. What does this office do? What does a treasurer do? What does an alderman do? What does a district attorney do, right? Like learning all of those things. So we all can play a part in that. For those of us who've actively voted before, maybe haven't voted in every election, but I hope something we said today makes you want to vote.
And help others.
And help others vote.
Yes. So I have a few things. One is, if you're interested in learning more about Ohio's diverse history, the Ohio History Connection has the historical monuments. And they did just recently induct a new class. They kind of surveyed all the monuments and realized, surprise, surprise, that there were big gaps, that a lot of the diversity, the beautiful diversity of Ohio was not represented in those monuments. So look at that. It's called, you can Google Remarkable Ohio and it'll help you find those monuments. Secondly, I just want to remind everyone that markers, that we are fundraising for a monument, and you can donate, and we need every size dollar. And that you can donate actually by going to the Capitol Square Foundation website and putting a donation in. I heard a couple things, and I want to make sure we remember them. The first is that progress takes time. And when we achieve progress, we have to defend it. The other is that we all stand on the shoulders of giants, and a lot of times we might not even know the names of a lot of those giants. And so we ourselves need to be the shoulders for the next generation. And that's something we can all do together by voting, by advocating for access to the ballot, by making sure that children can see themselves in public art. And with that, I'm just really honored that you're all here. This one was kind of about voting, what the 19th Amendment did and what it means today. The next one is really about women leaders, and I'm really excited about this panel. It'll start here in a few minutes, because we know that we need to close those leadership gaps. And I think we heard today, even just the act that the League of Women Voters supported, that was really great for white moms and babies, and really not great for others. That says to me that the League needs to represent the demographics of the people. That we need to make sure that we are looking at things from an intercultural perspective. And I would say the same thing in leadership halls like this, that when we close leadership gaps, our government will better understand the needs of diverse people and therefore be able to represent them. So I hope that you'll get to stay, because the next panel is going to be phenomenal. And with that, we just got a short break. Thank you. Thank you.